as we make our way through the book of Daniel, we have approached it thematically rather than chronologically, meaning that last Sunday, the first sermon in the book of Daniel wasn't Daniel chapter 1, it was Daniel chapter 4, which was maybe a little bit disconcerting and uncomfortable that we're not starting at the beginning. Hopefully today I can ease that discomfort a little bit, because now we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 5. And this is the story that follows on directly from what we talked about last Sunday. So we talked about Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the guy who besieged God's city, Israel, who took away its treasures and put them into the treasury of his God, who took away its people and brought them into captivity into Babylon. This guy had built an entire empire to the praise of his own glory. And God showed him that he is not the one who has a kingdom who lasts forever. He is not the one who is sovereign. God is sovereign. And he humbled Nebuchadnezzar, and then he restored him. And then Nebuchadnezzar glorified God's name as a result. Now we're going to see a companion story, a parallel image to that, and things are going to go a little bit differently in Daniel chapter 5. So the shape of the book of Daniel, the structure, is a double chiastic structure, stories that follow on from each other, but then backtrack the other way twice in a row. Last week we talked about this first blue square right here. The central message of the book of Daniel is repeated 4 times, and today we're going to look at the second one in Daniel chapter 5. In terms of the timeline and where we're at in history, the book of Daniel kind of follows on the story of these few kings. And sometimes in the book it'll say things like, in the first year of Belshazzar, I, Daniel, received a vision from the Lord. And that time marker is there at 552 BC. That's the first year of Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 5 takes place in this little gap right here. So I explained a couple of weeks back that Belshazzar was never technically king of Babylon. His father, Nabonidus, was the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Belshazzar was the prince. However, Nabonidus spent 10 years outside of his kingdom in a self-imposed exile, during which time Belshazzar ruled in his place, even though he was technically prince. Now, after Nabonidus came back, there's a little gap before 539 BC, when Cyrus the Great takes over rule of Babylon. And that's the space where our story happens. In fact, it happens right here at this particular date in 539 BC. The very night before Babylon takes over, or before Persia takes over Babylon. Let's go into Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to kind of do this in 3 stages this morning. We're going to read it, and I'm going to give you guys some explanatory notes so that we kind of have the information of the passage on our mind. That's going to be step 1. Step 2 is going to be to try to understand what the passage is trying to say. What is the message of this chapter? And then finally, we're going to talk about, and so what does that have to do with my life? So Daniel chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great festival for 1,000 of his lords. And in the presence of the 1,000 lords, he was drinking wine. When he tasted the wine, Belshazzar commanded that they bring the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his predecessor, had taken from the temple that was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines may drink from them. Then they brought in vessels of gold that they took from Jerusalem, the temple, the house of God that was in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So Belshazzar throws a party. It's interesting because when you get to the end of this chapter, we're going to realize Belshazzar dies this night. And his kingdom, his rulership over Babylon is ended. Not just because he, as an individual, dies, but because an entire different world empire takes over Babylon. Persia comes in and overthrows the greatest empire in the world. Why is he throwing a party? Historically speaking, Persia was outside the gates already. They were already under siege when Belshazzar throws this party. There's a historical written work called the Cyropaedia. It's a partly fictional, mostly historical biography of the life of Cyrus the Great. And in it, it recounts the story of when Cyrus, king of Persia, overthrew Babylon with a siege. And it even says in the Cyropaedia, book 7, chapter 5, verse 15, that when Cyrus came against Babylon, he knew there was a party going on inside Babylon. And he chose this moment to make his attack. And so people have speculated, why is Belshazzar throwing a party when his enemies are outside the walls? It might have been that it was a religious festival that took place on a given day. And whether or not your enemies are outside the gates or not, today's the day we throw the party. And maybe that's how Cyrus knew that this was happening. It might have been that Belshazzar was so confident in the might of his kingdom and the strength of his walls that he simply didn't care that Persia was outside. And his response was, to live it up, to get the wine out. It's possible that Belshazzar is throwing this party, and this is how the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, renders this passage, that his father, Nabonidus, had died in the battle with Babylon, or with Persia. And that this is him celebrating him taking over the throne from his father. That it's a royal event. What's interesting is the book of Daniel does not attempt to answer any of these questions. It doesn't even raise the issue that Persia is already here. So I think it could be taken to reflect any of these concepts that Belshazzar is proud. He thinks of himself as exalted and invincible. But it also represents him as worshiping false gods. Gods that have no life. Gods that are made of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So whether it was a royal event or a religious event, the book of Daniel is trying to paint a picture of who this guy is and how he thinks of himself. So what he does is he takes the vessels that were from God's temple, the vessels that God had made to reflect his glory, his holiness, and he makes them a part of his debauchery. Vessels that once held holy sacrifices to the God of heaven. Now Belshazzar is drinking wine from them. The verb to drink appears in every single verse of this section of Daniel chapter 5. It's emphasizing what Belshazzar is doing with the holy utensils from God's temple. We're going to recognize what Belshazzar has done, and we're going to see what God's response is going to be. Let's keep moving through the passage, starting in verse 5. Immediately, human fingers appeared, and they wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the palace of the king. And the king was watching the palm of the hand that was writing. And his face changed, and his thoughts terrified him, and his hip joints gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king cried aloud to bring in the conjurers, the astrologers, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man that can read this writing and can tell me its explanation will be clothed in purple and will have a necklace of gold hung around his neck, and he will rule as third in authority in the kingdom." Then all the wise men of the king came in, but they were not able to read the writing or to make known its explanation. Then the king, Belshazzar, became greatly terrified, and his facial features changed upon him, and his lords were perplexed. So as Belshazzar is having this party, and historians, and when I say historians, I mean Wikipedia, have speculated, like, what was this party like? Was it a banquet? A lot of them kind of agree, most likely this wasn't a banquet. This was more of a drunken orgy. That's what's going on in Babylon at this time. And he's in the middle of this, using God's own temples, God's own temple utensils to drink wine from. And this hand appears and writes on the wall, and it terrifies Belshazzar. It says his hip joints gave way. And depending on what translation you're reading that in, that can be rendered in a few different English ways. Most theologians agree that it's a euphemism for the fact that he wet himself. That's probably what that phrase means. Or it means he genuinely gave way and he fell on the floor. Either way, Belshazzar's response to the handwriting on the wall is that he is completely humiliated. His knees are knocking together. He's enfeebled by what's going on in front of him. And he calls out for interpreters. He's frightened and he's desperate for somebody to explain the meaning of what's going on in front of him. So here's what happens then, starting in verse 10. Because of the words of the king and his lords, the queen came into the banqueting hall. And the queen spoke up and said, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts terrify you, and do not let your facial expressions grow pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. And in the days of your predecessor, enlightenment and insight and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And O King Nebuchadnezzar, your predecessor, appointed him as chief of the magicians, the conjurers, the astrologers, and diviners. Your predecessor, the king, did this because there was found in him an excellent spirit and understanding and insight for interpreting dreams and explaining riddles and solving riddles. That is, in Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will tell the explanation." So it's the template story in the book of Daniel. The king is desperate and needs his vision or what he's experienced be explained. He needs an explanation, and nobody can do it, no matter how much the king offers. The king offered to have a robe of purple, which symbolizes wealth and royalty, a necklace of gold being placed on him, and making him third in the kingdom. And anybody who could make the explanation, he would give that to. And nobody can do it except Daniel. Why third in the kingdom? Probably because either Belshazzar himself was second in the kingdom. His father, Nabonidus, was the king. He's the prince. So the best position he can offer is third. Or it's possible that Nabonidus has passed away at this point. Belshazzar is becoming first in the kingdom, but second place is reserved for his own son. And so third is the next one he can offer. He's informed about the identity of Daniel and the ability of Daniel by the queen, it tells us. I think it's interesting that in the other stories, when Nebuchadnezzar has Daniel come in, it's not explained who tells him about Daniel, who reminds him that Daniel's here. But in this story it is. And I think it's done on purpose to help us see Belshazzar wouldn't have found Daniel by himself. He needed someone to explain it to him. And the person is the queen. And the identity of the queen is interesting because at first face value, it seems like the queen is probably Belshazzar's wife. But we've been told actually in the room already are his wives and his concubines. This individual comes in because of his crying out for help. If Belshazzar is the son of the king of Babylon, Nabonidus, the queen here is actually most likely his mother. His mommy has to come in and help him because he's wet himself. This is the picture of Belshazzar we have in this passage. And that's probably how she knew what had taken place before, because she was a generation older than he was. It's funny, she greets him with the phrase, "O king, live forever," which is ironic because this is the night that Belshazzar is going to die. So she tells him, you need to call for Daniel. He's the one who can help you with this. So moving on to Daniel 5. Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "You are Daniel, who are of the exiles of Judah, whom my predecessor the king brought from Judah, and I have heard that a spirit of the gods is in you, and enlightenment and insight and excellent wisdom was found in you. And now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me so that they could read this writing in order to make its explanation known to me, but they were not able to disclose the explanation of the matter. But I have heard concerning you that you are able to produce interpretations and to solve riddles. Now, if you are able to read the writing and to make known its explanation to me, you will be clothed in purple, and a necklace of gold will be placed around your neck, and you will rule as third in command in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, or your reward given to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and I will make known to him the explanation." The king offers these gifts to Daniel, and kings would often give incentives to the wise men of their kingdom. And part of the reason they would do this is because they wanted the interpreters to bring an interpretation that was favorable. It was a bribe as much as it was a reward. And Daniel rejects the bribe. And this serves to demonstrate his integrity, but it's also a demonstration of the fact that he understands what's about to happen. Belshazzar is willing to offer wealth and royalty and status and a position in the kingdom. But his kingdom ends this night. What he has to offer has no value. And Daniel recognizes this. So, Daniel's response, he rejects the gift and he says, "O king, the Most High God gave the kingdom and the greatness and the glory and the majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your predecessor. And because of the greatness that he gave to him, all the peoples, the nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wanted, he killed. Whomever he wanted, he let live. And whomever he wanted, he honored. And whomever he wanted, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and his spirit became hard, so as to act proudly, he was deposed from the throne, and his kingdom and the glory was taken away from him. And he was driven away from human society, and his mind was made like the animals, and his dwelling was with the wild asses, and he was given grass like oxen to eat, and with the dew of heaven his body was bathed, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdom of humankind, and whomever he wants, he sets over it. But you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. And now you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his temple you have brought in before you. And you and your lords, your wives and your concubines, have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, that do not see, and do not hear, and do not know, but the God who holds your life in his hand, and all of your ways come from him, you have not honored. So, Daniel compares Belshazzar to Nebuchadnezzar. And I think that's a really important goal of this passage, is to tell you the story of Nebuchadnezzar and then tell you the story of Belshazzar, and for you to put the two side by side and compare them. This isn't the last time the book of Daniel is going to ask us to do a comparison. But what Daniel tells us is that Nebuchadnezzar was a great man, a powerful man, who built himself a kingdom. But when he became proud, God humbled him until he acknowledged that God is sovereign. Belshazzar, who is not ascribed any accolades of greatness, and knew about what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar, chooses to exalt himself anyway. So Daniel rebukes him because he did not humble his heart. He exalted himself against the Lord of heaven. He drank wine from God's vessels. He praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, and he did not honor the God who holds his very life in his hands and gives him all that he has. So then, the palm of the hand was sent out from his presence, and this writing was inscribed. Now this was the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the explanation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and brought an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on scales, and you have been found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. This is a really strange and interesting passage of Scripture. The writing that is on the wall is not easily understood. And this is why nobody in the kingdom besides Daniel can understand it. So Daniel reveals the content of the writing as Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. When Daniel then goes on to explain the interpretation of this message, the actual meaning of each of these words, even though Daniel explains it, is still debated among scholars. A big part of the reason for this is that just like in Hebrew, Aramaic, which this section of Daniel is written in, was originally written without vowels. It's just the consonants of each word. And so what each of these words is specifically referring to is not immediately obvious, and the meaning can change. The meaning can change of each of these words and still fit the interpretation that Daniel gives. So I'm asking you all to kind of engage your mind and go on a bit of a journey here, understanding this. So the first word, Mene, it's repeated twice. Daniel doesn't interpret it twice. And so most Bible scholars agree it's repeated twice for emphasis, not because there's meant to be 4 words. There's 3, but one of them is emphasized. The word Mene, Daniel gives the interpretation: God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. What the word is specifically referring to might be a mina, which is a weight that's equivalent to 60 shekels. So it's a weight, it's a value of money. Also, the word many, which is again just different vowels applied, is a verb which means to weigh or to count, which is how Daniel interprets it. But also, this word for vessels, the vessels of God's temple, also has the same consonants. That's the word mani. And so whether Daniel is making reference to the vessels, he's talking about the verb to count, or he's talking about the noun, which is equivalent to 60 shekels, it could be all or some of those things. The word tekel, Daniel gives the interpretation, you have been weighed on scales and you've been found wanting. But the word tekel is a noun that means weight. It's the same word as shekel in Hebrew. It's a verb to weigh. It's also a verb in the imperfect tense, meaning you are light. Like you don't have enough to pay the bill, essentially. Tekel is also the verb for he fell or he stumbled, which is what Belshazzar did earlier in the passage, potentially. So there's multiple meanings for tekel as well. And then parsin, Daniel gives the interpretation, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. It's interesting because Daniel doesn't quote it directly. He quotes it as Perez. Did you notice that? Instead of parsin. Parsin is plural and Perez is singular. And Daniel changes it from plural to singular when he gives his interpretation. Parsin is a half shekel. But in plural, in Aramaic, it means 2 half shekels. But it's also the participle meaning the divided ones or the ones who divide, because Belshazzar's kingdom is going to be divided. It's also, parsin is also the word for Persian in Aramaic. So the point is, each of these words have multiple meanings, and I think all the meanings for them are intended. That there are these weights and measurements, that Belshazzar has been weighed by God. He's found that he doesn't have enough to pay the bill, that he's racked up for himself, and his kingdom is being taken away. It's being divided, and it's given to the Medes and the Persians. Now, when Daniel gives this interpretation, the king's response is that he clothed Daniel with purple and placed a necklace of gold around his neck, and they made a proclamation concerning him that he would be third ruler in the authority of the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom when he was 62 years old. So Daniel didn't want the gifts, but Belshazzar gave them anyway. And you might imagine that Belshazzar wouldn't be very pleased with what Daniel told him. But Daniel is exalted in the end, and the picture is of the king who had raised himself up, is acting like a little child, and he is humiliated and brought low. Daniel is lifted up and exalted because he is the one who has humbled himself before the God of heaven. So Belshazzar dies that night. Likely, historically, because of the invasion of the Persian army. Depending on which historical record you're reading, some say that Babylon essentially was deposed by Persia without a fight. Others recount, like the Cyropaedia, recounts Cyrus, the king of Persia, sacking Babylon by blocking the river and then going underneath the walls that the river used to flow under. Either way, Belshazzar dies because Cyrus has invaded. What's really interesting is if you add up, because Mene, Tekel, and Parsin all have meanings that refer to a specific amount of money. If you add up Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, plural, you get to 62 shekels. And it specifies that Darius was 62 years old when he took over the throne. So there's a fourth layer of meaning to these words that the hand writes. That's a lot of information. And I think we just need to spend a couple minutes understanding what message is being given here. And I think, first of all, it's about the holiness of God. That God raised up this nation because his own people had been unfaithful to their covenant, and God needed to punish them for their sin. And God can use evil people like Babylonian kings to accomplish his will. And somehow he can do so without compromising his own glory. And I think that is what this story is about. That this king would lift himself up and drink wine out of God's holy vessels and God won't let him get away with it. I think the story is about the comparison of two kings because it portrays Nebuchadnezzar as an individual who had a kingdom and greatness and glory. Whomever he wanted, he killed. Whomever he wanted, he let live. Someone who had accomplished incredible things, who God had to humble until he acknowledged that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of humankind. And then directly in contrast to that is Belshazzar, the guy who had accomplished nothing, the guy who had his whole kingdom handed to him, the guy whose mother has to come and rescue him because he's wet himself in fear. And Daniel rebukes Belshazzar, unapologetically tells him about his own pride and his need to humble himself. So this story is giving us, just like Daniel 4, Daniel 5 is about the nature of pride and humility, but it's giving us a second look at the nature of pride. Nebuchadnezzar was proud because of his achievements. Why was Belshazzar proud? What made him proud of himself? He didn't build a kingdom. He just had it handed to him. He was like a spoiled child. So the comparison begins to paint a picture of life through this lens of pride and humility. And there are times when, I'm getting ahead of myself, there are times when we feel proud because we have something to be proud of, but there are times that we feel proud just because we're acting like spoiled children. It's a second view of the sovereignty of God as well. Nebuchadnezzar received back his kingdom, not because Babylon was going to last forever. It would only last another couple of decades. And I think this is comfort for God's people in exile, and it's a vindication of God's justice, that yes, he will use evil kingdoms, but he won't let them get away with their sin. God restored Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't restore Belshazzar. It doesn't quite seem fair. Like, Nebuchadnezzar was he was the king who took Israel into exile. He was the guy who burned down God's temple. Why did God restore him? Surely if God had put Belshazzar through what he put Nebuchadnezzar through, 7 years of losing his mind in the wilderness, maybe he would have repented. Why did God not do that? I think it's an example of what the point of this passage is, that God is sovereign over the kingdom of humankind. And he puts on the throne whom he wills. And none can ask him, "What are you doing?" God gets to decide, not us. Notice also, this is a handover of the most powerful, biggest empire on earth, from Babylon to Persia. Belshazzar is now the son of the 5th king who sat on the throne of this empire, and now Darius the Mede receives it. Kings and empires have come and gone, but Daniel is still here. Daniel, in his humbleness before God, has been made to outlast the kingdoms of the world. I think these are the things that this passage is trying to say, but what do those mean for me? What is the significance of any of this for my life? Nothing we have is certain or guaranteed. It's given to us by the God who holds our lives in his hand. And I think the question that this passage is trying to get you to ask is, will I humble myself before God, or will I not? It's a check against our pride, because we can wake up on any given morning and look around us and think, look at this kingdom that I've built for myself. It's important to hear the book of Daniel say you might feel like Nebuchadnezzar on any given day, but you're Belshazzar too. All you have has been given to you by God. I think we also need to recognize like Daniel did, the futility of what the world has to offer us. Its gifts, its rewards, and its bribes. Daniel knew these things don't last forever. In fact, these things don't even last tonight. But the world loves to entice us with all that it has to offer, and we need to recognize how short those things really last. Because God has given us life that can outlast the kingdoms of this world. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this morning, and thank you for your word. Lord, I thank you for your glory that lasts forever. Lord, I thank you for your kingdom that endures. Lord, that you have offered us life in your name that results in you being glorified. Father, I pray that as we worship you this morning, Lord, that we would have a passion for your glory. Lord, that we would have a recognition of the shortness of life, of the smallness of ourselves, so that we would not be lifted up this morning, but you would be lifted up. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.